India imports more weapons than any other country in the world, by far, and it's not even at war. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are also big spenders. So what's behind the shopping spree? And who are the big winners in the global arms trade? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Selling weaponry is one of the most lucrative businesses in the world. Now, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute has put together a report on the biggest buyers and sellers. They looked at weapons sales between 2004 and 2008 and compared them to sales between 2009 and 2013. The think tank's report says India is the world's biggest buyer of arms, and it's Russia that is its main supplier. Now, researchers at the SIPRI think tank looked at 152 countries. The biggest buyers are India, China, Pakistan, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Collectively, they accounted for 32% of all arms imports. But India and China are the big buyers and have been since 2008. Together, they account for about 19% of all weapons imports. So let's take a look at the biggest suppliers of arms. The leaders are the United States, Russia, Germany, China and France. Together, those 5 countries are responsible for 74% of global arms exports. But it's the US and Russia that are the biggest players. They supplied 56% of all exports. And it's China that has had the biggest jump in its exports, replacing France as the world's 4th largest supplier of weapons. For more on this, I'm joined by our guests from Stockholm, Peter Weiseman, Senior Researcher with SIPRI Arms Transfers Programme, and from London, Ben Moores, Senior Analyst at IHS Jane's DS Forecast. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. Peter Weiseman, interesting reading your report, and what struck me was the 14% increase in arms sales. What do you think that suggests about the arms industry right now and what's happening in the world at the moment?
Well, it suggests that they were looking very hard for new markets. Many of the arms industries are based in the US, in Europe. In both parts of the world, we see that there has been somewhat of a decrease in military expenditure, and therefore they are looking for export markets. That's very important for their survival and to keep up their sales. So that's, I think, important to stress. And on the other hand, we also see that this gives us once again an indication that there are many states in the world which see armaments as a very important part of their overall security and stability in regions and use them to address the threat perceptions they have. But it also raises questions about to which extent countries are really prepared to engage in arms control, in disarmament, and try to seek other ways than armaments for solving their tensions and problems between each other.
Ben, what did you make of the report and the fact that more countries seem to be buying more arms?
I think it's a twofold thing that's happening. So we looked at these numbers and we assessed that over the last 5 years the market's jumped from 56 billion to about 67 billion. And there's 2 key factors behind that. Firstly, you're seeing traditional players, countries like Saudi Arabia and India, who are now importing around 5.8 for Saudi, 6 billion for India per annum in military equipment. The traditional big players are not only maintaining their market imports, but increasing it dramatically by something like a third over the last year alone. And then you're seeing emerging countries. So, for example, Mexico, Indonesia, Vietnam are now all starting to import significant amounts of military equipment. Indonesia will be doing about 1.5 next year. Vietnam's doing nearly $1 billion now. Mexico's doing 700 million. So it's 2 sides to why the growth's happening.
Is it true that the more you buy, the more it'll fuel the arms race?
I think certainly if you look as to why some of the growth's happening, particularly in West and East Asia, and to a lesser extent the Middle East, you are seeing that the regional tensions are fueling demand. And you can see this when you actually look down into the details. So we tracked about 30,000 individual exports, programs and program elements. And what we found was that if you looked in the Far East, what you were seeing was that it was being dominated by naval and military aviation sales as opposed to land vehicles, whilst in, say, the Middle East it was land vehicle sales because of the different threat context that's going on.
Yes, Peter, how much is the dispute over the islands in the East and South China Seas driving China's military build-up?
Well, I think that's definitely the case. I think that all sides in that region are reacting to each other. If China increases its military expenditure and therefore its arms procurement, you will see that India will react to that. Therefore, Pakistan will also react to that. On the other side, we see that China, of course, and that's the other side of the picture, China also sees the US and Japan to some extent also as its rivals, as having certain claims which China believes are theirs. So they will react to what the US does. Then China will then cause, for example, the Philippines and Vietnam to also counter with further arms procurement. So it's a constant action-reaction process there, in which the suppliers of these arms play an important role because they provide the means to continue this action-reaction process, which is not really an arms race per se, but it could turn into that. And that's really the big question here. How can these countries which import the arms, but also the suppliers together come to a way to stop this kind of armaments processes and not only see this as a market opportunity?
China is a massive exporter, but they also have their own industry and it's growing dramatically. I mean, we have no idea at this stage what their arsenal is, do we?
I think we know a lot about what the Chinese are trying to do. There's a lot of information available about it. They really have been able to build up an arms industry over the past 20 years, really improved it very much from what it used to be. And they're now capable of producing their own equipment. And for sure, they're investing an enormous amount of money in that. Of course, having said that, we have to realize that China is still by far not as big a spender on military equipment as, for example, the United States is. And of course, we also have to look at the many countries in the region which together also are procuring a lot of arms through import and partly also through their own production.
Ben, is China the legitimate bugbear of the region? What do you think this says about the regional tensions at the moment, particularly with the focus on islands? I mean, some people are predicting that there might even be a short, sharp war with Japan over their Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Do you agree with that?
I think there's three things worth looking at here. First of all is Chinese exports. So if we look at Chinese exports and we say, well, they're about $2 billion a year, but they're all going, nearly all of them are going to India's neighbours, Bangladesh, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. If we then look at why India is spending so much on military equipment in recent years and why it's importing such vast amounts of naval equipment, Talwar class frigates, carriers, Kilo class submarines, P-8 maritime patrol aircraft, it's because they are losing there's a huge submarine gap going on in the Indian Ocean versus China. Now, if we look at, say, China versus Japan, it's not as bad as it first looks. From the get-go, China's importing huge amounts of military equipment, especially military aerospace engines, to be able to compete against Japan over conflicting areas. But if we look at both sides and we look at the ranges of their aircraft and then we look at their tanker refueling capabilities, actually it's very hard for both sides to effectively engage each other if outside of their immediate environment.
Is that when the US steps in and the US making itself known with its sales, making its presence known in the region there?
I think US sales are to an extent driven, certainly a lot of US exports are driven by FMS, so foreign military budgets to assist countries, but that budget isn't going to Japan, it's going to countries like Egypt and Israel. That's where the bulk of that funding goes. If we look at, say, Taiwan, where there's been a lot of US imports in the last year, it's jumped by about $1 billion to $2 billion. Taiwan has imported a lot this year. It's actually because of political considerations. What's happened is for years and years and years, there's been a delay in US exports to Taiwan in an attempt not to aggravate the Chinese.
Peter, it's interesting when you look at the US military and its role in countries like Egypt, which Ben brought up, and how in the past the US has been funding the military in Egypt, but on the condition that Egypt buys US gear, uses US intellect. So it keeps going back through the system, refiltering its way back to the US.
That's correct. Egypt receives this kind of equipment, or gets the money to buy weapons in the United States, and it is of course an effort by the United States to make sure that Egypt stays friends with both the US and especially with Israel. But these sales and this military aid is really on particular conditions, and that has very much to do with the political condition in Egypt. At the moment, the US has decided that because of the violent change in the government in Egypt, it cannot really continue to supply these arms unless they get real reassurances that the regime in Egypt will go back to a kind of a democratic path, and that really stops them from this. And that's why the US stands out as a rather special supplier. The US has, next to economic reasons for supplying arms, also many political reasons for doing so, and has been mentioned, it does supply weapons either for free under special conditions, and will stop those flows when it decides that something happens in the recipient country which is not what they want to happen, which is not according to their political wishes. They are willing to impose arms embargoes on states which receive their equipment.
Yes, I mean, the US has suspended part of the 1.3 billion defense aid package that it sends to Egypt, but Russia has stepped in there. What do you think this says about Russia's aspirations in the Middle East, considering that Russia also supports Syria's Bashar al-Assad?
I think Russia has seen, first of all, a commercial opportunity. It's not the first time that Russia has offered or marketed weapons in Egypt. It has already sold over the past few years a range of equipment, but now, of course, it has the opportunity to sell more. At the same time, it also can try to increase its influence in a number of states in the region. But right now, I would think that mainly commercial reasons are its main reason for doing this. And this same you see also, for example, for Russia trying to market and sell weapons in countries like Iraq or in the United Arab Emirates. It's the commercial reasons which seem to come first in those cases.
And commercial reasons could also lead to false justifications, couldn't it, Ben, to invade a country, as we've seen in Iraq, for example?
In the case of Iraq, I think it might have been slightly more complicated than to sell arms to Iraq. I think it would have been far more effective to have made friends with the Ba'ath government and then sold the military equipment. Because
yes, but you had a massive US military force there, didn't you?
You did, but if you want to, the problem is that if you look at where defence expenditure actually goes, it can go in staffing, it can go on day-to-day maintenance, operations, or you could build military equipment. So actually, in many respects, it wouldn't be a good commercial strategy to invade a country on the basis that you might increase, they might increase their imports of military equipment.
How do countries use their own military when deciding what sort of packages to go for? For example, in Britain, something like 100,000 people are working in the arms industry.
I think what's really important is that if you are going to develop and manufacture and final assembly large, complex, especially aerospace systems, you do need to find a way to get the cost down. And as defence budgets fall in, and have been for years now in Western Europe, and they've fallen very significantly now in the United States as well, by nearly coming up to nearly a third now. You do need to find other ways to other partners to help develop or offset the original cost of developing an expensive piece of equipment.
Peter, let's go back to your research and look at what's happening in the Middle East and the fact that the UAE appears to be on some sort of spending spree, as does Saudi Arabia. What's happening there?
What happens there is that the UAE already since about a decade has been spending quite heavily on a whole range of advanced equipment, everything from advanced combat aircraft equipped with cruise missiles to the means to defend against the aircraft of other states in the form of air defense systems and also anti-ballistic missile systems in recent years. And Saudi Arabia had been away a little bit. They had invested a lot of money in new equipment in the 1990s, especially. Then they had to absorb all that, and now they are back in the game in the sense that over the past 5 years or so they have signed a number of really big contracts, some of the biggest contracts signed in those 5 years for new equipment, and those are being delivered now. This seems to be very much related to a number of issues. First of all, a perceived threat from Iran. Secondly, also in the case of Saudi Arabia, the knowledge that there are conflicts in Yemen and Iraq, and in the case of Yemen, they have been involved in that themselves. And of course, also important to mention the issue of the Arab Spring and the risk that somehow may also come to Saudi Arabia, weapons needed to protect the regime. Finally, I also would want to mention there it's important to take into account the risk that corruption is one of the factors that drives some of the arms procurement, and also the fact that there is the issue of prestige, trying to buy weapons just simply because it looks good, it makes you look like a major power, not necessarily because you need them or you might not even know exactly how you want to need to use or deploy them, but just for the fact of having them may also play an important role. And finally,
but you need a lot
has
more
been mentioned,
than just fantastic military hardware, don't you? I mean, driving up and down on National Day, showing off your weaponry doesn't make you an effective force, does it?
No, absolutely not. And there have always been major questions already for decades about to which extent Saudi Arabia in particular can use all the weapons it has bought. It's still dependent on a lot of foreign aid in that sense. There are a lot of British and American, and I presume also others, in Saudi Arabia to help to maintain and to operate all this fancy equipment. So are they an efficient force? It's extremely hard for me to say from a distance, but there are some questions there. And also, I mean, again, here important to mention, there is this aggressive marketing by the many supplier states and companies involved, which really need to export now. As has been said before, you cannot produce arms on your own really anymore, except if you are the United States, and even then it's hard to do so. It's just too costly. You need to export, and so there's a really major pressure to do this, and very aggressive marketing, especially in places in the Middle East where there is little oversight and transparency in arms procurement and military issues in general.
Sure. And Ben, what do you make of Saudi Arabia, which is a good example, in the fact that they are possibly not adequately trained in the equipment that they have? I mean, look at the embarrassing defeat when they tried to take on the Houthi rebels in Yemen in 2009.
I think there's certainly a number of limitations in Saudi capability, and there is a degree of prestige buying. But if you look at the way that they offset a lot of their programs, they actually look for additional capability, well, additional training and services to basically to deal with that with that weakness in their overall capability. So they're certainly aware of it. And also, it is difficult to absorb large amounts of equipment for any military. And Saudi, for example, is a country who is aware of this issue and is trying to deal with it.
Do you foresee a change in the common defence policy in this region, considering the cooling of relations between Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia? As you know, UAE, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain withdrew their ambassadors from Qatar.
I certainly think this is going to be an issue. I don't think it's going to be a key issue. I think the main reason for the high levels of defence imports in the Middle East, which this year ran at $20 billion, is going to be primarily to do with the price of oil. I think that the Saudi Arabia and Qatar resolved some of their territorial differences back in the 80s. There is the threat. I think the main thing is actually domestic disturbances, a kind of an Arab Spring that might change one of the states into a more hard line state that could threaten the other. So the rest of them keep a degree of spending which is quite high to deal with various threats. And the other thing is that some of it's cyclical. So if we look at Saudi right now, Saudi spending is quite high because they're buying F-15s and they're buying Eurofighters. Oman, again, it's spending a lot of money at the moment because it's got a large aviation program going through. UAE, is import, I think, $3 billion this year, but it's primarily to do with air defence and Iran. But in future years, we are going to see Qatari spending and Kuwaiti spending both rising because in the last couple of years, they've been through a cyclical low in terms of defence spending. So they do have a range of programmes coming up.
Peter, where do you think all this leaves the covert arms transfers? I mean, how does it compare to what you found in your research?
Well, we know not so much about the covert arms trends, but of course they are covert after all. But I think they make up only a very small portion of total world arms transfers. But in a number of cases, of course, they can have a major impact. Look at, for example, at Syria, where they are extremely important to keep the rebels supplied with weapons to help them to actually continue their fight. I mean, that's how that conflict is fueled, you could say, if you wanted to put in those terms. And also elsewhere we see that small numbers, small volumes of weapons supplied to certain conflict regions or countries really can make the difference, really can mean that a conflict can erupt or can continue. Take, for example, what happens in the Central African Republic. Really, the numbers of weapons that go there are very low, but it's enough to keep to throw that country into complete chaos, and we have seen it elsewhere too. We see it in Mali, we see issues like that in places like Colombia, we see it in the south of the Philippines, etc. It's the small flows which really can make a big difference for certain conflicts.
Ben, what do you make of the covert arms industry?
I think, like just been said, to an extent, you know, the amount of money involved is quite low. So if we look at, say, India, which in 2015 will be importing $8 billion worth of equipment on booked equipment alone today, against Africa, which this year imported $700 million worth of equipment. They're two very different figures. In terms of the amount of money that goes to, say, Syria or some of the Mali or places like this is very low because they're not buying large systems. And the other thing is that if you buy large systems, you can't hide them. You can't hide fighter jets, the importation of fighter jets, and you can't or vehicles or ships. So, and they make up the bulk of the market. They're going to make up like 96, 97% of the market. Even countries like Israel, which export a lot of mission systems and air defense equipment to countries like India and in the Far East, you know, where they do try to hide this, they routinely try to hide their exports. In the end, it's quite easy to track them, and we've managed to track, you know, hundreds of Israeli programs amounting to about $1.5 billion a year.
Ben, do you think if the industry were to be smaller that fewer people would be killed?
No, I think in Rwanda you learnt that, you know, if you really want to kill people, you can kill people with your cutlery in very large numbers.
And in fact, more people are killed with handheld weapons, aren't they, than the big stuff that's
Absolutely.
out there?
If you look at statistics of what actually kills people in war, you'll discover that the vast majority of it is it's mortars, and mortars make up 0.001% of the total arms market.
Peter, if you could project yourself to the next 10 years, where do you see the industry going? What sort of trends can we look forward to?
I think when it comes to international sales, I think we see a stronger competition between a larger variety of states. We've already seen how China has come back as a major supplier of arms in the past 5 years, or even a bit longer. We see that a country like South Korea is now really trying to get into the market too, and as you can imagine how successful they were with cars and mobile phones, well, this may very well be repeated in the field of arms to some extent too. We see even that Japan, which always had very, very strong restrictions on arms exports, is now considering to change those restrictions and become an international arms supplier too. So I think that's an important new development. More states building up their arms industries and being capable to also play a role in this international arms transfers scheme. And then of course you have the fact that states also are more kind of integrating. So nowadays you can have a situation in which you have a Chinese ship with Dutch radar and maybe an Italian cannon on it. So it's more becoming a global industry which is working together, once here, once there, sometimes competing, etc. So it's really much more of an integrated global industry where there are national competitors, but they also work very much together. And I think that's a development which we will see in the coming decade or so, becoming even stronger.
Okay, well, thank you for giving us a sense of what's going to possibly appear in your next report. From Stockholm, Peter Vazeman, Senior Researcher with CIPRI Arms Transfers Programme. And from London, Ben Moore, Senior Analyst at IHS Jane's DS Forecast. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And just remember, if you want to watch the show again or tell anyone about it, you can find this show and many more on our website. Just follow the links for shows and Inside Story. I'm Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.